Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette. So glad you're with us to stay curious today with a monthly guest that always has some great stories, Mr. Bob Granath.
Right.
Welcome, sir.
Well, glad to be back.
Well, we're glad to have you back. Bob, for many years, was a public affairs officer for what companies? Tell us who you work
Lockheed
for.
Space Operations Company, and then went to work for United Space Alliance. And after the end of the space shuttle program, I went to work at the NASA press site.
Great. Met some people I know, like Carol Cavanaugh, and
Oh
of
yeah,
course, the great Hugh Harris, and
yes, yes,
so forth. Well, he's got a website that is called spaceagechronicle.com. And go and check Bob has these untold stories of the space age. And that's what we do. And we're glad that Bob's found Stay Curious in our museum and wants to share some of these stories he has. Today, we're going to talk about Max Faget. And I didn't. Let me see your copy there
all
too.
right.
Max Faget, this gentleman right here, seemed always to be in a bow tie.
That's right.
And this is one of America's great spacecraft designers. And Bob's going to tell us all about that in a minute because I just wanted to have a little small talk with you here.
Oh yeah,
Yesterday was the final launch of the great orbiter OV-103
that's
Discovery
right.
in
Yeah,
there. And
yeah,
14 years ago.
yeah. It's hard to believe it was that long because it just seems like those final shuttle missions were just a couple of months ago. But yeah, it's getting into the past now, and really a great closure to the history of the space shuttle program and all the things we were able to achieve in the 3 decades that we were flying the space shuttle.
Did you have anything to do with that flight? Where were you working?
Well,
What
I was
14 years ago, Bob?
working in the public relations office of United Space Alliance, and so on launch day, I was escorting some of our VIPs out to one of the primary NASA viewing sites so they could get an up close look at it. And so we were experiencing the rumble and roar of the space shuttle taking off. It's something that I was there for, had to be over 100 of the space shuttle launches, and it
Wow.
just seems like it never got old. It was fascinating to watch each one fly, and we now know, of course, that Orbiter Discovery is on display at the Smithsonian Museum out at Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. And it's great that a lot of people now have a chance to come and see that up close. And of course, out at the California Science Center, the Orbiter Endeavour is out there. I had a chance to go out to see it when it was resting
Oh, did you?
horizontal, but now they have it attached to external tank and solid rocket boosters, and that's going to be a fantastic display, sitting there with a full stack space shuttle, just like it's ready for launch. And then, of course, here at the Kennedy Space Center Visitor Complex, it's absolutely outstanding because the space shuttle is positioned just like it was in space. The payload boy doors open, the robot arm extended, the Canada arm,
Oh,
and
it's
so
the best.
people have a chance to see it up
It's the
close.
best. Well, I've seen two out of the
Put it
three.
back where it was.
Okay. All right. We've got hi Marty there. We a couple of them say the volume seems low, Marty, as we're on there. So pump up the volume. And we're saying hi to Cliff Watson, who's in Pomona, Australia,
Ah,
having a Wednesday morning brekkie there. Dave Stengy's up there in Michigan. Boy, he says it's almost 50 in Michigan today, and
Put the mic there.
they've had below on there. And we've got greetings from Colorado from Mitch Rothman. And we can't wait to see your smiling face soon. Tom Celentano, Dean Babcock, 60 degrees in central Illinois. Wow. That's kind of the weather we've had. But they've been hit hard with below zero,
oh yeah.
teens. Oh my gosh. So glad you're warming your bones up there, Dean. Gary Gerald, good afternoon to him. He's in Collins, Georgia. Steve Jokums, I'll bet he's enjoying a little heat wave up there. And Carlton Bailey says, howdy, Bob. So good to see you again. Always great hearing your stories.
Ah,
And you guys have a question for Bob. He's got a pretty well set up program here about Max Faget. That's why we chose this backdrop of the Bacanor. That's a Soyuz rocket behind Bob there, and the very top of it, the escape tower, has something to do with the story you're going to tell about Max
Oh, that's
Faget.
right.
So, a story I didn't know about. Um, so we'll just let you get into that. Everything seems good here. Tell me when to advance the slide there for you, my friend, and let's
Okay.
just throw up there. We just wanted to make sure. I thought I had a shuttle fest slide up there. Just wanted to remind everybody. Nope, don't have the shuttle fest slide. Didn't make it. Okay. Um, let's talk a little bit about Max Faget, pronounced Faget, correct?
Right. Right. Well,
Take it away, Bob.
as I've done research on the history of NASA's space program, I found he was one of the most fascinating individuals that is very little known about him. It's not one of the persons you often hear about, such as Werner von Braun or Bob Gilruth. They were very well known. Maxwell, he was in the background, played a very crucial role in the history of our space program. He was the primary designer of the Mercury spacecraft, the Gemini spacecraft, helped lead in the development of the Apollo Command Service module, and he was one of the first to begin work on what became the space shuttle. Well, what happened was, if you go on to the next slide, you see an early diagram that he did. In fact, that's his signature down at the bottom, one of the earliest designs of the Mercury spacecraft. And so as he was going along developing the early designs for the Mercury spacecraft, he was busy in his office one day doing some development work. And he says that Bob Gilruth, who was the head of the Space Task Group within NASA, heading up the group at the Langley Research Center in Langley, Virginia, came in, and Bob Gilruth came in one day and says, "What are you going to do if the Atlas rocket blows up beneath the Mercury capsule?" I didn't have an answer for that. So Bob Gilruth said, "Well, you better get to work on that."
Yeah.
And so he did. You get into the next picture coming up, and you'll see a Mercury Atlas standing on the pad, and that red tower on top of the Mercury capsule is the launch escape system tower. The idea is that if there is a problem with the launch vehicle during the ascent, that tower can pull the capsule with the astronaut aboard away from the exploding rocket. It will go up to a high enough altitude, drop the capsule, parachutes open, and it would come down and land safely out in the Atlantic Ocean. And so what Max Faget liked to see is this is a design that was created on command. So with that, now the next slide coming up, you'll see is Mercury Atlas 3. That was launched in April of 1961. It was one of the early unmanned launches in the Mercury program.
We just had Mercury Atlas 2 was launched last week in space history.
Oh, that's right,
yeah.
in history. Well,
February.
And this one, April 25 of 61, this was launched, and it's a nice color picture of launch. But the black and white images, the first one on the top, the black and white image shows the Atlas as it's going up. And if you live on the Space Coast and you're used to seeing rockets go up, you know they go up for a while and they begin arcing, still going up, but tilting out over the ocean, arcing out over the ocean. Well, this one just kept going straight up, straight up, straight up. And they realized the guidance system had failed. And so range safety has the command to blow that rocket up so that it doesn't go off course and land on Titusville or Cocoa Beach. And so public safety is paramount. The middle image there is what you're seeing is the escape tower begins to fire and pulls the capsule away from the rocket. The rocket explodes. The bottom picture shows the capsule coming down onto the parachute just a mile off of Cape Canaveral. It was picked up, and had there been an astronaut aboard, he would have been fine.
So it worked just fine.
Yeah.
They did not plan to test it on that.
Yeah, it was a good test because it wasn't planned and it worked exactly as designed. Now, in the next image you've got there, you see that same picture of the escape tower on top of a Mercury capsule used a very similar system on top of the Apollo command module. had there been a problem with a Saturn rocket during launch, that tower could pull the capsule with the 3 astronauts aboard and pull it to safety. And then in the next image, you'll see that the Soviet Union started using an escape tower on their Soyuz spacecraft. When they began flying those back in 1967, they still use it today. And the image on the right is a Chinese Shenzhou rocket, which looks very much like a Soyuz. It also has a launch escape tower that would save the astronauts if something were to go awry during the early stages of launch. Well, in the next image, you'll see that there is a Soyuz sitting on the launch pad at the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And there were 2 astronauts on board getting ready for a trip up to one of their early space stations. So you go to the next one, and you see an image of Vladimir Titov and Gennady Strekalov. They were just 90 seconds from liftoff when they began to open the fuel valves. Fuel started going into the engines of the Soyuz rocket booster, and there was a leak of the RP-1 propellant, the highly refined kerosene. And when that leak started, a fire started at the base of the rocket. In the next image, you can see that there is a
Okay, yeah. Well, then we have a question for you.
Okay.
We'll show good
Oh,
through
yeah,
this
go on.
this near disaster here.
Yeah, what you see here is the fire is starting, and very shortly after that, the next slide, you'll see the escape tower fired, pulled the 2 cosmonauts away, and in the slide after that, you can see a diagram of how it worked. The escape tower pulls the capsule away from the rocket, drops the capsule, parachutes open, and a few kilometers from the launch pad, the 2 cosmonauts landed safely. Using this launch escape
Let's have to
tower
go back
that
and look at that.
ultimately had been invented by Max Faget. It's just the Soviet Union borrowed that design and put it on their Soyuz.
That was on the pad. They had
Right. It was
they-
sitting there on the pad before liftoff, and they just started opening the fuel valves, and just before the engines ignited, and then
The-
it was the explosion.
Dang, that would be. Ooh,
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
That was a
They were
very large
very
rocket.
lucky there.
Yeah, there was.
So when they ejected here with the tower, Marty's got a question about that.
Okay.
And Michael Bruno is asking, how many G's taking off on the escape tower generates?
That's a good question, because what happened is the 2 cosmonauts came out it pretty much unscathed, but they did have some bruising because they went from standing completely still on that launch pad to somewhere between 15 and 16 G's, 16 times
Wow.
the normal weight of gravity. And that pressure with those straps holding them down in the seat caused some bruising, and that was the only injuries they had. But it was a pretty significant force to go from sitting still to boom, you're flying very fast. Now, the extension of this story is this launch was scheduled to take place in September of 1983. And what happened is several years later, in 1995, Max Faget is working at the Johnson Space Center in Houston. And a Russian Air Force general is visiting the Johnson Space Center, and Max has a chance to chat with him. And he says, you know what? I invented that escape tower that saved 2 of your cosmonauts. I never got a medal for that. Of course, he was just joshing
Yeah.
and kidding. The Russian general pulls out a card and says, I owe you 1 space medal, and gives him the card. And so they have a good laugh. Well, it turned out Titov and Strekalov were in Houston at the Johnson Space Center at that time. And so the next day they called in Max, and they had a brief ceremony, and they actually presented him a medal for inventing the launch escape tower that ultimately saved these 2 cosmonauts.
That's a picture of him wearing it there.
Yeah.
huh?
And
That's,
so-
you can't make that up. That's pretty interesting there.
Yeah, what he said about this is, he told the Russian general, I invented that escape rocket that saved your crew. I never got a medal for that. And so it turned out that the 2 cosmonauts were there. They presented him with the medal. And then Max had a good opportunity to see how it worked out. Vladimir Titov said, we were sitting up there on the Soyuz waiting to launch, and then all of a sudden it started shaking. I said to myself, something is about to happen. He said, next thing I know, we're 2,000 meters, about 6,500 feet up in the air.
Wow.
And the Russian general added that escape system worked perfectly. So kind of an interesting story about something he invented for the American space program. The Soviet Union borrowed it. It wound up saving 2 cosmonauts.
Absolutely.
And then what started out as just sort of having some fun with it, they actually presented a medal for that.
That I was just looking up here that who's on the space station right now in Crew 9 is Nick Hague. And Nick Hague also owes
Right.
his life to this because he survived with a cosmonaut
Yeah.
that's up there with him right now and abort that they
Yeah.
use so that's very interesting there.
Yeah, having
Actually,
working abort mode can be very important because rockets, while you make every effort to make them as safe as possible, every now and then there are things that can go wrong.
it wasn't the escape tower that saved Nick Hague. They were in aboard after the escape tower had ejected up
But
there.
they had
still, it was
an abort mode that they could use. They wound up with a ballistic
right.
landing, but they came through it unscathed and had an opportunity to fly to the space station on a future date.
And Mark Thiel's on board. Mark Warabutz, thank you, Mark, for watching. Julie Clays wishing us a happy Tuesday. And Tom Usiak's got a comment there, Marty. Why don't you share that comment of Tom? He's on the Usiak family microphone there.
Yeah, Tom is saying, I remember being told that the escape tower on A1, Shepard Standard 5 was more powerful
Al
than.
Shepard.
Okay, I thought it was A1. Didn't make any sense. Al
Al
Shepard
Shepard.
Standard
Not
5
A1.
was more powerful
We
than.
old people, I'm telling you.
Yeah, when you get our age, yeah.
That's right.
Well, that's an interesting point, and I remember Al Shepard talking about that shortly after the Apollo 14 mission. He, of course, was our first astronaut in space flying the Mercury Redstone. Then he flew on the Apollo Saturn V in 1971, almost 10 years later. And somebody reminded him that the launch escape tower on top of the Apollo for the Apollo Saturn V's, that escape tower had more thrust than the Redstone that had launched him 2 years earlier. And that was a good example of how far the program had progressed in just a short 10 years.
Yeah, absolutely. That's an incredible stat to point out there, Tom. Just really, that's amazing. And that technology still in use today, except there's no escape tower. What does SpaceX use? They don't have a tower.
I'm going to get into that. They have what they call pusher rockets. Go on to the next slide.
Yeah, we'll talk more about.
And what you see here is that is the launch of Yuri Gagarin back in 1961. And that red arrow points to an opening where in the early stage of that launch, he could have ejected. Now, none of the Vostok cosmonauts, when they were flying one cosmonaut at a time, had to use that to escape during launch. But the diagram shows that during the Vostok program, none of the 6 cosmonauts stayed aboard the capsule. The landing would just have been too rough to stay in it. So when they got down to about 8,200 feet, the cosmonaut would eject from the capsule and come down on a separate parachute. And if you go to the next slide, it's sort of diagrams that. This is a diagram of a cosmonaut ejecting from the Vostok capsule. The seat would fall away, his parachute would open, he would land, and a few hundred yards away, the capsule would come down separately.
The first 6 cosmonauts did it that way, including Tereshkova. She was chosen because she was an expert parachutist.
That's right.
I've seen this at the Cosmosphere.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, very cool model. I mean, actual hardware
Oh,
at the
yeah.
Cosmosphere in Kansas, Hutchins, Kansas.
Yeah.
For that.
Now, on the subject of ejection seats, that was the safety system we had during the Gemini program. The astronauts could have ejected from the pad or during the early stages of the launch. If either of the astronauts pulled a ring, a D-shaped ring that was right on the bottom of their seat, they reached down and yanked that, the doors would fly open and ejection seats would fire them away. The seats drop off, parachutes would open, and they'd land offshore. And then when you get to the next slide, this one, the picture on the left is the SpaceX Crew Dragon. On the right is a Boeing Starliner on the launch pad. But that picture of the Crew Dragon is a test of their abort system. They actually launched one with that abort system from Cape Canaveral before they launched the first crew. And that launched out over the ocean. When they got high enough, parachutes opened, they landed. And so that's the escape system they would use for our commercial crew program.
I find that very interesting system, and many of us, Bob, do you remember before this successful test, they had a test out there that it blew it up to smithereens.
Oh, yeah.
And it was briefly on like Twitter or something like that. I remember a bunch of people sharing that on Space Hipsters. Emily Carney, you saw that on there. But I mean, there's nothing left of it. They had an actual video of it there, and then all of a sudden it blew up, and then there was nothing left of it. So these are very powerful hypergolic fuels
Right.
on these Draco. But boy, what a heck of a picture that is. You see the actual
Oh, yeah.
nozzles there, Marty. That's really, never seen that picture before. And then, of course, the Boeing Starliner there has a similar type of system, as you
That's
said.
right. Now, for the Orion spacecraft, for our program to send astronauts back to the moon, this is the first Orion heading out to the launch pad for its first test flight, where it was launched on a Titan 4 or a Delta IV Heavy, and it had that escape tower in it, which was tested successfully. But that would be available if our astronauts going up on an Orion needs to get away from the rocket very quickly. So that's sort of history of some of the different kinds of escape systems that we've had. Now, just to get on and start talking about Max Faget himself, Roger Launinas, who was working in the NASA History Office, wrote in 2008, he was writing about Max Faget, a part of an article on leaders, visionaries, and designers for the American space program. And he describes Max Faget as a Cajun from Louisiana. Faget is known in the space community for his cantankerousness, for being eccentric, and he was a genius committed to spacefaring.
Cantankerous.
Cantankerous, yes.
Don't
No
hear
one
that
could
word
be-
very much, Marty. You know anybody who's cantankerous around here?
We don't know that, do we?
Uh-oh, he was pointing a finger at me, folks.
Okay. He says no one could underestimate the impact on NASA's engineering culture and the pattern of success than through the 3 decades of Faget's involvement in the space agency.
That's amazing. That's underestimated this man's impact on our space
Oh, yeah.
program.
Like I say, the reason I thought he'd be fun to talk about is he's just not as well known as some of the other key players in the history of the American space program.
Mm-hmm. Comment from Marty there? Who's got a comment?
Mark Dell is saying, if I remember correctly, the pilot had no control over the ejection sequence. And then he also states the Gemini spacecraft ejection seats had a short envelope in which to be used.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, there was once those escape systems fire, they're pretty much all automatic, from what I understand. And then, on the Gemini, it only had a limited period during the ascent where you could use that. Beyond that, they had other abort systems that they could use.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the story on Max, he was born in 1921 in British Honduras. It turned out his father was a medical doctor working down there, and he had developed a revolutionary treatment for people suffering from leprosy. Well, it turned out one of the things Max said in an oral history project interview back in June of 1970 said, Max says, my brother and I were both interested in model airplanes. We were very enthusiastic model airplane builders, And so when I entered college, I majored in mechanical engineering and minored in aeronautics. So it turns out he went to LSU, Louisiana State University, graduating in 1943. And so shortly after he graduated, he enlisted in the Navy and served on Navy submarines during the Second World War.
It's with the submarines.
Served in submarines you know, going through the Pacific Ocean during the war.
Really? Because a spacecraft is kind of a submarine and
Oh yeah.
void of space. That's interesting.
Now, a lot of people feel like if you know how to live in the cramped environment of a submarine where you have to take along whatever provisions you need, teaches you a lot about how to get along all along space flight. So it turns out after he got out of the Navy at the end of the war in 1946, he went back and talked to one of his professors at LSU. And he said, as soon as the war was over, I visited my professor and he recommended that I seek a job at the NACA laboratory at Langley Field in Virginia. The NACA was the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. It was an organization designed to help airplanes fly better. And so he started going to work there and started working on a project because the Air Force wanted an aircraft that could fly more than 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3. And so he started working on a project that eventually would become the X-15 rocket plane that could fly like 6.5 times the speed of sound. And ultimately, the X-15 could go up to as high as 102,000 feet. And there were at least a few of those X-15s that actually made space flights. But while he was working on that,
as well as Neil Armstrong was an X-15 pilot.
That's right.
He didn't go above the Kármán line, I don't think, but
No.
several of his buddies did.
Oh yeah, Joe Engle, who flew on the space shuttle, is one of those who did go above the
Yes,
Kármán line. He got
Joe.
astronaut wings for that. But then what happened is in October of 1957, the Soviet Union launched the Sputnik satellite. A few months later, the United States launched Explorer 1, our first satellite. And so the next thing, people started thinking about sending a human into space. And so as early as March 1958, Max Faget presented a paper on how you would design a spacecraft to take a single person into space. And this is Max with...
What year was that?
He started doing that in March of 1958. This is even before NASA had been formed as an organization.
For the selection of Mercury astronauts from 59.
That's right. He was already thinking about how you can get a person into space. And the next slide, you'll see how the various designs for the Mercury capsule evolved into various stages. The first one just looks like a common rocket nose cone. But then it started to evolve, and by the time you see on the one on the far right, that's what the Mercury capsule wound up looking like.
84 inches because they were going to be put on an Atlas rocket. So that was
going to have to fly off an Atlas or a Redstone for the suborbital missions. And so what he said is he was designing, with a proper design, he felt that a human could fly into space. And then, of course, shortly after, President Eisenhower changed the NACA into NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. We selected 7 test pilots to become our first astronauts. And so, as I talked about earlier, Max Faget was working with the NASA Langley team to develop the Mercury capsule. And this is one of the early Mercuries being checked out in Hangar S at Cape Canaveral Air Force Station for the first mission. And of course, the idea was use the Mercury rocket to launch on suborbital missions, simply up and down. And then the Atlas rocket, bigger rocket, would be used to send the astronauts into Earth orbit. And the next slide up is a picture of the launch of Alan Shepard on May 5, 1961. The interesting thing to the NASA people is just 3 weeks after Al Shepard flew, President Kennedy went before Congress and proposed that we send a man to the moon and return him safe to the Earth before the end of the decade. Well, what Max Faget said about that was Bob Granath, the head of the Space Task Group, and now as the task group was moving to the Johnson Space Center in Houston, started saying we need to have a program that is a bridge between Mercury. Mercury basically told us that a human can survive outer space and can do useful work there. It would take something else to teach us how to do all the things you're going to need in the Apollo program to take astronauts to the surface of the moon and return them. And so Faget said Gemini was primarily a result of Bob Granath insisting with NASA headquarters that it was essential to have more experience in space operations before we tried flying to the moon. He went on to say Gemini also was designed to be able to make sufficient translation maneuvers and required use of much more powerful auxiliary propulsion systems. And so we had the Gemini spacecraft. He was the primary designer for this spacecraft as well. And with Gemini, we learned how to have astronauts survive in space for up to 2 weeks, could rendezvous, dock with another spacecraft, and it's when we learned how to do spacewalking, something that turned out to be more difficult than we thought, but during the Gemini program, we figured all this out and we were ready to go. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this next slide is an aerial view of the early Johnson Space Center. At that time, it was called the Manned Spacecraft Center in Houston. All the people at Langley working for NASA started moving to the Johnson Space Center where he worked. And so he not only was involved in the engineering development of the Gemini spacecraft, the next slide shows him during the time that he was developing the Apollo Command Service Module. Now, one of the interesting stories that tells you how Max Faget was always a perfectionist. You go to the next slide. You can
Before we go there,
Oh yeah.
what that's Marty Slaw in his left hand there, cover the
Oh yeah. Yeah.
lunar module there.
Yeah.
And those of you new to stay curious, Marty worked on the lunar module, and he's told us many times about being up on the pad with the Saturn V in that cone that covers the lunar module there.
Right.
Doing your job, right, Marty? Got a question there? But I think that's cool. Look at Max holding your little spacecraft launch adapter.
Launch adapter, lunar adapter, I've heard it both ways.
Spacecraft lunar adapter.
Right.
Okay. And I've also heard Saturn lunar adapter. So that's an acronym that's debatable there.
Oh
Bob.
yeah.
Marty's got his finger on the UCAC family microphone. Go ahead,
Okay.
my friend.
Yes, Steve Holcomb is asking, Bob, did you ever hear anything about rumors that Max Faget stood up at a NASA meeting where Dr. John Hobart discussed lunar orbit rendezvous and said, his figures lie, his figures lie? Did that happen?
I'm not sure about that. I've heard a lot of stories. I know when they started discussing lunar orbit rendezvous as a method of getting to the moon, there were several approaches. One was just build a very huge rocket and a big capsule that would launch, go straight to the moon, land the top part, take off from the moon, come back. And then there was another approach called Earth orbit rendezvous, where you launch some parts on a Saturn I and another part on another Saturn I, and you bring all this together in Earth orbit and then fly to the moon. What is referenced in John Hobart is he had the idea of sending one rocket with two spacecraft, the command service module and a lunar module, where you have them go to the moon in one capsule, two guys get in a lunar lander, go down to the surface, launch back up, rendezvous with the mothership, and then come back in the command module. And at first, that was not a popular approach at NASA headquarters. But the more he pushed that, and the more people started thinking, you know, this really makes sense. And so that was the approach that we used, where we had launched a command service module with a lunar module and have two spacecraft on one rocket. And that was the approach we used, and it turned out to be very successful in the Apollo program.
LOR, John Hobart. of Iowa professor, I believe,
Yeah,
is where he
yeah.
was, and another hidden figure
Oh
of
yeah.
our space age there. So
Yeah.
many of them. Hope you're enjoying this look at the great spacecraft designer Max Faget with Robert Granath. Robert has found our Stay Curious podcast and comes on once a month with one of these wonderful introspectives to our great American space program. So I'm enjoying it tremendously and glad that you all are out there enjoying it. Uh, let's take it to the
All
next
right.
level
Yeah.
here, my friend.
All right. Now this is a shot of
sorry, Marty.
Mission Control in Houston, and the story is the first unmanned launch of an Apollo Command Service module was launched, flew, re-entered the atmosphere, landed successfully. Everybody was celebrating, and more recently, our selected astronaut at the time, astronaut Joe Allen, was looking around, and we were congratulating everybody, and they saw Max Faget, walked over and said, "Max, congratulations, it worked well." Max was sitting there doing calculations. He was still busy looking at the data that was coming back, and he said, that heat shield was thicker than it needed to be. If we cut it back to where we can save 700 pounds on the weight of that spacecraft. So while everybody else was celebrating, he was already being the perfect engineer, saying, how can we do this better next time? And so that was a good example of the way Max Faget tended to work. Well, and
Perfectionist, like you were saying there.
And that's the kind of thing you want in engineering, where you're actually trying to make it just as perfect as you can. Now, in the next slide, you can see that he's actually sitting inside an Apollo Command Service module, checking things out to make sure his design is going to work. As in fact, in this case, he's sitting there with astronaut Frank Borman, and just checking things out with an astronaut to make sure everything's are going to go as planned. And speaking of Frank Borman, you go to the next slide, you can see an Apollo Command Service module in orbit around the moon. And of course, by the fall of 1968, astronauts were flying in the space shuttle, in the Apollo program. And in December of 1968, we had the first crew to leave Earth orbit and go all the way to the moon. And one of the things that Max was pointing out about that is he says one of the biggest challenges to Apollo was propulsion. And in this engine, you can see that big service propulsion system engine at the base of that Apollo spacecraft. He said the power to travel to and from a destination that's 234,000 miles away, propulsion is going to be critical. He went on to say when astronauts in Earth orbit, they can come down easily, because all they have to do is slow down a little bit. But when you're at the moon, you've got to have a rocket that will fire to push you out of lunar orbit, heading back to Earth. And so that was one of the biggest challenges, is that service propulsion engine was one of the things that absolutely positively had to work once you were in lunar orbit.
And it did.
It did. And of course, this slide shows picture that Neil Armstrong took of Buzz Aldrin working at Tranquility Base, the lunar module sitting there, the experiments they set up, the flag, and in
laser
the distance,
reflector there, center left.
That's right. And the seismic experiments, what Buzz Aldrin is standing next to. And in the background, you see a little pole there. That's the TV camera that sent all those TV cameras images back to us. But even while we're getting ready to fly that first moon landing mission, Max Faget said that Dr. George Miller, who is NASA's Associate Administrator for Manned Spaceflight, started pushing us for the next program, wanted to develop a reusable spacecraft. He visualized that NASA really wanted a reusable vehicle that could fly often and can be used over and over again. And so this image shows Max with an early design for a space shuttle orbiter. He built that in early 1969, even before that first moon landing mission. And the next slide shows him testing it, where it's a time-lapse picture where he dropped it and showed how a space shuttle orbiter would return like a glider. The idea would be that you launch like a rocket, come back like an airplane. Now, that particular model that was so historic, and that picture of the test, that was April 1 of 1969. It was well before the first moon landing mission. All right.
As you know, when you go out to Kennedy Space Center and see the Atlantis building and the great reveal of Atlantis,
Right.
it starts out with Max Faget calling a bunch of in the little movie they have,
Right.
calls them to a hangar. Nobody knows what they're doing there for the hangar, and he throws this model
That's it.
at them and
Yeah.
says, "We're going to make a reusable spaceship." It's
All right.
and of course, I love that presentation. You've
Oh,
seen
yeah.
it
It's
several times.
outstanding.
Makes goosebumps to anybody watching it there. But
Well-
it starts with Max throwing this little model
Yeah.
out there.
And then you go to this next slide, and just as you mentioned, this is the display out at the Kennedy Visitor Complex where that actual model that he tested in 1969 is one of the things on display to tell the history of the
Mhm.
space shuttle program. Now, the next slide shows his original vision for the space shuttle.
Oh, I love that.
It would be an orbiter and a winged piloted booster rocket that would launch. And once it got the orbiter part of the way to orbit, the booster would turn around and fly back and land back at the Kennedy Space Center. The orbiter would fly its mission, as the space shuttle eventually did, and then it would come back and land at Kennedy Space Center. Now,
One of the many
what-
concepts. I love looking at this outside a hangar, and
Oh, yeah.
but yeah, it was going to be nothing disposable. Everything
Right.
completely like
reusable.
yeah.
Well, what Max said was it was going to be a two-stage spacecraft with both stages having wings and landing gearing and be able to land at an airport and be reused. That went through a series of revolutionary processes when we began to study the thing, and we got a better idea of implication and total reusability. Another thing that wound up happening is the Department of Defense started getting involved and said, we need a payload bay that can accommodate some of the DoD payloads that we'll be sending up on the space shuttle. That resulted in the space shuttle payload bay getting larger, the orbiter itself getting a different design, and the eventual design was an expendable external fuel tank to fuel the main engines and two strap-on solid rocket boosters that would be picked up and reused. And this, of course, is the launch of STS-1, the first space shuttle, on April 12, 1981. And if you go to the next slide, you can see what the
Bob, you always know. Do you know the difference between STS-1 and STS-2 with a
Yep.
quick eye shot?
that black stripe around the top of the external tank.
You got it, my friend. Absolutely.
Yeah,
And then, so if you look at the stabilizer, the rudder, it's got a camera and detections on top of that, but
Yeah.
that's hard to see in that photo.
yeah.
But no, you look
Well,
for the
actually,
black
they-
ring at the top, folks, and that's one. That's how to distinguish it from two.
Yeah, and the instrumentation they put on top of the vertical stabilizer, I think, was added on. I think it was after STS-9, and then after that, that was always another sign that you're looking at
Yeah.
the orbiter Columbia.
Plus the black chine on the wing of Columbia there.
Yeah,
That's the only
that's right.
orbiter that had that.
And this is one of the orbiters in space approaching the International Space Station. You can see it with the cargo bay doors open and one of the modules for the International Space Station. And so it was a payload bay that could carry a payload the size of a school bus. So it was a big payload.
Absolutely.
Well, that first launch was in 1981. And at the end of that year, Max Faget retired. And when he passed away in October of 2004, astronaut Joe Allen, who I mentioned earlier, wrote this eulogy, said Max Faget's invention of the Mercury capsule was already on his drawing board just 9 months after the launch of Sputnik, and still several months before the formation of NASA. From the very beginning of the space age, Max pioneered virtually every American spacecraft involving human spaceflight. And so you cannot underestimate the value that this gentleman had on our space program. Not very well known, but certainly one of the keys in getting us on the road where we are now.
And very insightful. Thank you, Bob. I learned a lot about Max Faget. Familiar with some of what he did. I think it's very interesting. He was in a submarine,
Oh, yeah.
and then so he would be thinking about how to keep astronauts alive in that confined space
Right.
in there. So we appreciate everybody watching today and chiming in. We've got Elena. I will have you read off some of the people, our family that was
Okay.
watching today there. But Elena Adkara is in South Africa. She's saying good
Oh.
afternoon to us there.
Oh, that's
And
great. Got
go
Cliff
ahead and
Watson, Dave Strange, Mitch Rothman.
Stangy. That's Dave Stangy.
Stangy.
Yes,
Okay.
he's
Sorry about
our
that.
#1 watcher up in Michigan.
Super. Tom Salendra.
Salentano.
Salentanen. Gary Gerald, Steve J, Carlton Bailey. Hi, Carlton. Doug Forrest, Tom Usiak, Julie Clay, Michael Bruno, Mark Terrell, Mark Warzelbins. Anyway, glad we have
Keeping you
all the-
alive there with pronouncing
Yeah.
names in
Oh,
the
yeah.
press corps
Well,
there.
Well,
There's always
that's always been one of the
Yeah.
challenges when I start talking about the Russian space program. Like there was this one cosmonaut named Nikolai Rukavishnikov.
okay.
It took me a long time to learn how to pronounce Rukavishnikov.
Yeah, once you get it down, you get it down.
Yeah.
Mastracchio's a hard enough one.
Uh,
Rick Mastracchio. I'm not
Yeah.
sure I'm pronouncing that American astronaut's name right in there, but we really enjoyed it. I love these type of shows where we do. It almost qualifies as STEAM education out there for us. It keeps everybody in touch with these figures. And Bob, here's these figures of our American space program that are the space workers. The astronauts are
Oh, yeah.
easy to remember, and a few of the higher echelon people. But then you get down to your Marty Winkles and other people like that. They're the real people that made it work, right, Bob?
That's it. And that was one of the greatest privileges I had going to work in the program is I got to meet a lot of people who were doing the day-to-day work. What one of our Lockheed presidents like to refer to as the wrench turners.
There you
The
go.
guys who are actually putting their hands on the hardware and making it fly. And there was nobody who respected the work of those wrench turners more than the astronauts who were flying on those spacecraft. And they loved coming down here, walking among a lot of the people who were working on that because they knew that their lives depended on the work they were doing, and they did an absolutely outstanding job. From the beginning of the program to date, we have some of the best people, and one of the reasons why our center directors like to refer to the Kennedy Space Center as the world's premier multi-user spaceport, and it's successful because of the people who are out there doing the work every day.
And the people out there are a spectrum of society and
Oh, yeah.
everything out there. Very from the beginning, diversity's played a big role.
Oh yeah,
And you've been
that's
part of that in the media.
Oh yeah, that's been one of the great things. You have people from all over the country, a lot of different backgrounds, a lot of different cultures, and all of it pulls together to make the program as successful as it is.
It does. And here's Bob's website. He's got other stories up there and photos. Bob, you really had a great selection of photos I hadn't seen before, didn't he, Marty?
Mhm.
Picture of Langley was I'd never seen that one before. And that Faget in the command module of
Oh yeah,
Apollo with still had his little bow tie on there.
always had the bow tie.
Yeah. Marty, go ahead there.
Yeah, Dean Babcock is asking, what individuals were involved in the selection of external tank and solid rocket boosters with the propulsion system?
I'm not sure I got all of the question there. What was that again?
What individuals were involved in the selection
Oh,
of the external tank
okay.
and solid rocket boosters?
Shortly after Apollo 11, President Nixon asked Thomas Paine, the administrator of NASA, put together a program of where we can go from here. So he knew one of the best minds of looking to the future was Dr. Werner von Braun. So he moved him from his position as director of the Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, to NASA headquarters, and made him essentially an associate administrator for future planning. And so they developed a very elaborate program of where you go from here. A space shuttle, a space station, a tug that would go from low Earth orbit to lunar orbit, and then building a base on the moon. So they presented that program to President Nixon. He said, "This is great. I love it." So they go back. They're ready to make it happen. And what happened was, is the director of Office and Management Budget called up Thomas Paine, said, "This is how much money you're going to get." He said, "We can't do all of that with this little money." He said, "What will you need first?" The space shuttle. Okay, so you got the space shuttle. So now the budget is constrained where you're not going to be able to do the kind of orbiter where you have an orbiter and a flyback booster and all the other constraints that were coming in. If you're going to point to one person who came up with the idea of an orbiter that's reusable, take off like a rocket, land like an airplane, attached to an external fuel tank that's expendable, you do a new one every mission to fuel the main engines, the strap-on solid rocket boosters. The one person you can point to who came up with that final design was Werner von Braun at NASA headquarters. And that was one of the last projects that he worked on before he left NASA and went to work for Fairchild Industries.
And now you know. Thank you for staying curious, Dean Babcock. I can't say I knew that Werner von Braun was exactly responsible for that. That's interesting. But I do know this. If Grumman had gotten the contract for the space shuttle, Marty, they would have launched it on what?
I'm not sure if it's a 747, but it's going to be launched on an aircraft.
I thought it was got Saturn 1B. We've got a model of a space shuttle on the Saturn 1B that they were going to use to launch it.
But one of their concepts was also off a 747.
Okay.
And maybe not a 747. Maybe someone out there knows
But,
more than I do.
Yeah,
But
Grumman did lose out on it to Rockwell as sort of a political decision going to California from New York. But
because Grumman did get the contract initially, and then President Nixon said, no, the contract's going out to California, not Long Island.
yeah, so there you have it. And that's a juxtaposition, the crossroads, I call them, just things that if they'd happened a different way, on there. But, and of course the shuttle was to be 100 flights, each. Discovery launched today or yesterday, 14 years ago, on February 24th, 2011. That was his 39th flight, and it was a clean ship, everybody said. And everything going on just flawlessly there. So, well, I'm glad you've all enjoyed the show today. We do enjoy Robert being on. Robert, you're welcome to do have you got on your website other profiles of notable people on there? Might be good to dust off.
Well,
a couple of
there
those
are.
folks.
There's
Rocco Petrone, for example. I'd be interested in knowing more about the great center director, not center director, but launch
director for the early Apollo missions. There's a number of individuals that have played key roles, and I've written about some of them. Some of the other missions that have taken place. Last fall, I posted a story on the Voskhod 1 mission, in which case the Soviets had the Vostok that could take one astronaut or cosmonaut to space at a time, and they're busy developing the Soyuz that could be used if they had decided to go to the moon. But in the meantime, Nikita Khrushchev called up Sergei Krikalev, the head of the Russian space program, and said, "Oh, the Americans are getting ready to launch 2 people. Can we launch 3?"
Yeah.
And so they did. And so the way they did it is they took out the ejection seat. There was no abort mode. And to fit 3 people in, they had to put them in just regular clothing. They could not fit them in with spacesuits. So fortunately for them, it flew successful.
Yeah.
One of the main spacecraft designers on that was Konstantin Feoktistov. When Sergei Krikalev went to Feoktistov and said, "Look, help me redesign this thing for 3 people. He said, I don't want to do it. I think it'll be dangerous. He said, look, if you design this for me, I'll let you fly it. So he became one of the 3 cosmonauts that flew on that.
Literally sat across the lap of the other 2.
Yeah.
There. Great story to tell, Voskhod 1. And then Voskhod 2 did the spacewalk of Leonov.
That's right.
There,
They
so.
were wearing spacesuits on there. So,
That's right.
Alexei Leonov could exit the spacecraft and perform the first spacewalk.
Well, we're glad that you all love space history as much as we do here at the American Space Museum, where for over 20 years we've been preserving the birth of the space age right here in its delivery room, Bob.
That's right.
Brevard County. So we're glad always to have you on board and can't wait for what you come up with next month. And tomorrow we've got Mikey Haddad with Scott Vongen. Are going to be talking about STS-99. That was a 3D mapping mission of the shuttle that went, I think, to the highest incline because it got some of the Antarctica and mapped some of the Arctic Circle up there. So Mikey will be here tomorrow, and Thursday we have Terry White waxing up his mustache to come up
Very
here,
good.
and we're going to talk about the final flight of STS of Discovery and STS-133. So stay tuned for that. Thank you, Dave Stange, for your comments, and Bob, Steve Jokums up in Illinois says thank you, Bob. Everybody enjoyed this presentation of yours, Bob, and I'm sure they can't wait to have you back again. So
All right. Very good.
appreciate your support
Thanks
of the
for having
American
me
Space
back.
Museum this way. Bob's going to be involved at Starfest, so you all that come to that will get to hobnob with him personally there and there. So thank you all for watching. Marty, everything okay on our Streamlabs board there? You did a great job. So tomorrow we'll have Mikey in the seat here with Scott Vongen, and we're going to talk about 3D mission of mapping the Earth on STS-99. I think that was in the year 2000.
Right.
So until then, I'm Mark Marquette saying thank you all for watching. Thank you, Bob. And I can't wait to see you in our museum to bridge the space between us. Thanks so much for watching.